April 12, 1945 marked the day when young Wilhelm Becker's desperate plea would echo through the ruins of what was once a thriving German town near the Elbe River. The boy, no more than 9 years old, stood amid the rubble of shattered buildings, his hollow cheeks and threadbare clothes telling a story that needed no words. His mother, Frau Helga Becker, lay inside their makeshift shelter, a converted cellar beneath what remained of their family home. She had not eaten in 4 days. The American Third Army had rolled through the town just hours before, their tanks crushing the remnants of German resistance like paper beneath steel treads. The soldiers, part of General George Smith Patton Jr.'s rapid advance toward Berlin, had seen countless devastated villages. They had witnessed the horrors of war etched into every cobblestone and burned timber. Yet nothing quite prepared Corporal James Mitchell and his squad for the sight of Wilhelm running toward their convoy, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face, crying out in broken English he had learned from a schoolteacher years before. "Please, sirs, Mama hasn't eaten for days." Wilhelm's voice cracked with desperation as he tugged at Corporal Mitchell's uniform sleeve. The boy's fingers, thin as twigs, trembled against the olive-green fabric. Behind him, the town of Torgau smoldered, its medieval church tower standing like a broken finger, pointing accusingly at the sky. The squad had stopped to secure the area, checking for remaining Wehrmacht soldiers or civilians who might pose a threat. Private Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, was the first to lower his rifle completely. He saw in Wilhelm's face something that transcended enemy lines, pure, unbridled desperation born of love for a dying mother. "Sarge, we got a kid here," Mitchell called out to Staff Sergeant William Harris, who was coordinating with another unit 50 yards down the street. It's the sergeant, a weathered veteran from Tennessee who had fought through North Africa and Sicily before landing at Normandy, made his way through the debris field. Wilhelm continued his plea, switching between German and English, his small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. "Bit mean," Mutter disturbed. "My mother is dying. No food for days." He pointed frantically toward the cellar entrance, partially hidden beneath a collapsed wall. The standing orders were clear. Fraternization with German civilians was discouraged. Resources were to be conserved for Allied troops. And the advance toward Berlin could not be delayed for individual cases of hardship. Millions of Germans were starving across the collapsing Reich. One more woman, one more child, what difference could it make in the grand calculus of war? But Sergeant Harris looked into Wilhelm's eyes and saw something that military regulations had not accounted for. He saw his own son, William Jr., who was 8 years old and waiting for him back in Chattanooga. He saw the fundamental question that would define whether their victory meant anything at all. Would they become the monsters they had fought against, or would they prove that humanity could survive even the most brutal conflict? "Mitchell, Chen, follow the boy," Harris ordered, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of authority and compassion that separated good soldiers from great ones. "Take medical supplies and rations. I'll handle any questions from command." Wilhelm's face transformed in an instant, hope flooding into features that had known only despair for weeks. He grabbed Corporal Mitchell's hand and began pulling him toward the cellar, speaking rapidly in German, his words tumbling over each other like water breaking through a dam. Private Chen shouldered his medical pack and exchanged glances with Mitchell. They both knew they were about to witness something that would stay with them long after the guns fell silent. The cellar entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some ancient tomb, darkness swallowing the weak April sunlight that struggled through the smoke-filled air. Wilhelm scrambled ahead with the desperate agility of a child who had navigated these ruins countless times, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. Corporal Mitchell clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom and revealing makeshift wooden steps that descended into the earth. The smell hit them first, not the putrid stench of death they had learned to recognize in France and Belgium, but something more insidious. It was the odor of slow starvation, of bodies consuming themselves, of hope evaporating one molecule at a time. Private Chen covered his nose with his sleeve, not from disgust but from the sudden, overwhelming sadness that such a smell could convey. "Mutter, I brought help." Wilhelm's voice echoed in the confined space, bouncing off brick walls that had somehow survived the artillery bombardment that had leveled the neighborhood above. "American soldiers? They have food." As Mitchell and Chen navigated the final steps, their flashlight beams revealed a scene that would haunt their dreams for decades to come. The cellar had been transformed into a survival shelter with touching ingenuity. Frau Helga Becker had arranged salvaged furniture to create separate Aritz's sleeping space, with threadbare blankets. A small table with a chipped ceramic pitcher, and even a corner where Wilhelm's few remaining possessions were neatly organized. A battered tin soldier, a water-stained book of German fairy tales, and a photograph in a cracked frame. Helga herself lay on a makeshift bed constructed from old coats and pillows. She was 34 years old, though she appeared 20 years older. Her face, once beautiful according to the wedding photograph propped beside her bed, had become a landscape of sharp angles and sunken hollows. Her blonde hair, which Wilhelm had told them during the descent, was usually kept in perfect braids, now lay in limp strands across her forehead. Her eyes, however, retained a fierce intelligence and maternal protectiveness that not even starvation could extinguish. "Wilhelm 9, she whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "You should not bring them here. It is not safe for you." She tried to sit up, her thin arms trembling with the effort, before collapsing back onto the coats. Even in her extremity, her first thought was for her son's safety. Private Chen immediately knelt beside her, his medical training from Fort Sam Houston overriding any remaining hesitation about treating enemy civilians. He placed 2 fingers on her wrist, counting her pulse. "Weak and thready," he reported to Mitchell. "Severe malnutrition, probably dehydration. We need to get fluids into her slowly, or her system will shut down completely." According to accounts documented in military records and later interviews by historian Stephen Ambrose for his book Citizen Soldiers, American troops encountered thousands of such cases in the final weeks of the European War, though few were documented with the intimacy that this particular encounter would later receive. Mitchell unslung his pack and removed his canteen and several Karashin packages. The Karashins, developed by physiologist Unsel Keys and produced by the Wrigley Company, contained precisely calibrated nutrients designed to sustain soldiers in combat. Each package held crackers, canned meat, chocolate, and cigarettes, treasure trove to someone who had not eaten in days. "Ma'am, we're going to help you," Mitchell said slowly in English. Knowing she likely could not understand, but hoping his tone would convey his intentions, Wilhelm immediately began translating, his young voice taking on an adult gravity as he explained that the Americans meant no harm. Chen carefully opened the canteen and lifted Helga's head with practiced gentleness. Small sips, he instructed Wilhelm in English, demonstrating with his fingers. "Tell her, Klein Schluck." He remembered the German phrase from a basic language guide the army had distributed before they crossed the Rhine. Helga's cracked lips touched the canteen rim, and she took a tiny sip of water. Her eyes widened at the sensation: cool, clean water, untainted by the rust and debris that had contaminated most of the remaining wells in Torgau. A tear rolled down her gaunt cheek, carving a clean path through the grime that had accumulated over weeks of existence in the cellar. Wilhelm knelt beside his mother, holding her free hand with both of his, speaking to her in rapid German. Mitchell, though he could not understand the words, recognized the universal language of a child reassuring a parent that everything would be all right. The role reversal was heartbreaking. This 9-year-old boy had clearly been caring for his mother, not the other way around. What happened to her? Mitchell asked Wilhelm, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it spoken aloud. Wilhelm's face hardened with a maturity no child should possess. The food stopped coming in February. Papa was killed in Russia 2 years ago, Stalingrad. Mutter worked at the factory making uniforms, but the factory was bombed in March. Then our house was hit. She gave me all the food we found. Every day she said she had already eaten, but I knew she was lying. His voice broke on the last word, the adult facade crumbling to reveal the terrified child beneath. Private Chen continued his examination of Helga Becker, his trained hands checking for additional injuries beneath the layers of worn clothing. His fingers discovered something that made him pause, a crude bandage wrapped around her left forearm, the cloth stained brown with old blood. He looked at Wilhelm questioningly, and the boy's face flushed with shame. "She cut herself 3 weeks ago, on broken glass when she was digging through the ruins looking for food," Wilhelm explained in his careful English. "It became infected. I tried to clean it with water we boiled, but I did not know what else to do. The doctor, Herr Dr. Schmidt, was killed when his clinic was bombed." Chen carefully unwrapped the bandage, revealing an angry red wound that had partially healed but showed clear signs of infection. In the pre-penicillin era, for most German civilians, such infections frequently proved fatal. Helga winced but did not cry out, biting her lip as the medic examined the injury. "She needs sulfa powder and proper bandaging," Chen told Mitchell. "Good thing Sergeant Harris sent us with the full medical kit." He retrieved a small envelope of yellow sulfanilamide powder from his. He packed the same medicine that had saved thousands of Allied soldiers from infected wounds, and sprinkled it carefully over Helga's injury before applying a clean gauze bandage. While Chen worked, Mitchell opened one of the ration boxes and removed the crackers. He handed one to Wilhelm, who stared at it as if it were made of gold. "Eat, kid," Mitchell said gently. "You need your strength too." Wilhelm shook his head violently, pushing the cracker toward his mother. "9, for Mutter first." "She has not eaten." Mitchell felt a lump forming in his throat. He broke the cracker in half and placed one piece in Wilhelm's hand, the other in Helga's. "Both of you," he insisted, his tone making clear that this was not negotiable. Helga's trembling fingers grasped the cracker and she brought it to her lips. The first bite was tentative, as if she had forgotten how to chew. Then instinct took over and she began eating with careful deliberation, tears streaming freely down her face now. Wilhelm nibbled his half, watching his mother eat with an expression of such profound relief that both American soldiers had to look away. Corporal Mitchell found himself thinking about his own mother, Sarah Mitchell, who waited for him in Michigan. She had packed him off to war with stern instructions to remember that every person, regardless of nationality, was somebody's child, somebody's parent. "Don't let the war make you forget that, Jimmy," she had said on the train platform in Detroit. "Promise me you'll stay human." "Chen, how much can we spare?" Mitchell asked, assessing their remaining supplies. "We've got our own rations, plus the emergency stores. You can leave them for care ration boxes, 2 canteens of water, and the rest of the medical supplies from this kit. That should sustain them for 3, maybe 4 days if they're careful. And then the relief organizations should have moved in." The relief organizations Chen referred to were already mobilizing across occupied Germany. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, established in 1943, was preparing massive aid operations. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and the gap between military conquest and civilian relief could prove fatal for people like Helga Becker. Wilhelm watched the Americans with a mixture of wonder and confusion. His entire life had been shaped by Nazi propaganda, portraying Americans as barbaric monsters, tools of Jewish conspiracy, inhuman enemies who would show no mercy. Yet here were 2 American soldiers, one white, one Chinese, kneeling in a German cellar, using their own supplies to save his mother's life. "Why do you help us?" Wilhelm asked suddenly, the question emerging in hesitant English. "Your propaganda. It must say Germans are evil." "My teacher said Americans hate us." Mitchell paused, considering how to answer a 9-year-old's question that philosophers and theologians had struggled with for centuries. Finally, he simply said, "Because you're hungry, and we have food, and because your mother is sick, and we can help. That's reason enough." Helga, who had been listening despite her weakness, spoke in German. Wilhelm translated, "She says she is sorry. Sorry for the war. Sorry for what our country did. Sorry that you had to come so far from your homes to stop us. She says she never believed in the National Socialists, but she was too afraid to speak out. She is ashamed." Private Chen, whose parents had fled Japanese-occupied China before he was born, looked at this dying German woman with unexpected compassion. "Tell her that surviving with dignity in an undignified time is nothing to be ashamed of," he said quietly. "Tell her that protecting her son was the most important thing she could do." As Wilhelm translated, fresh tears flowed from Helga's eyes. She reached out with her unbandaged hand and touched Chen's arm, then Mitchell's, her lips forming words that needed no translation. "Danke. Thank you." Above the cellar, Sergeant William Harris stood amid the ruins of Torgau, staring at the medieval bridge spanning the Elbe River. This river, which had witnessed centuries of German history, would soon witness one of the war's most symbolic moments, the meeting of American and Soviet forces, splitting Hitler's Reich in 2. But Harris was not thinking about grand historical moments. He was thinking about 2 young soldiers in a cellar and a decision that could cost him his stripes. Lieutenant Francis Hartley approached, his boots crunching on broken glass and masonry. Hartley was 23 years old, fresh from officer candidate school at Fort Benning, and he wore his authority like an ill-fitting uniform, too rigid, too conscious of regulations that had been written in peacetime by men who had never seen what war did to civilians. Sergeant Harris, where are Mitchell and Chen? We're moving out in 15 minutes. Command wants us 5 miles east by nightfall. Harris turned to face the young officer, his weathered face expressionless. They're conducting a humanitarian assessment, sir. Civilian casualty situation. Should be up shortly. Hartley's eyes narrowed. Humanitarian assessment. That's not our mission, Sergeant. We're combat infantry, not the Red Cross. Every minute we delay is a minute the Germans can use to regroup or escape. Sir, the boy's mother is dying of starvation. Mitchell and Chen are administering basic medical aid and providing minimal rations. It'll take 10 more minutes. Tops. The lieutenant's face flushed red. Jesus Christ, Harris. Do you know how many dying German civilians there are between here and Berlin? Thousands. Tens of thousands. If we stop for every sob story, we'll never win this war. Hell, this war is already won. We're just cleaning up the mess. Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice so the other men could not hear. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. That boy is 9 years old. His father died at Stalingrad, fighting for a regime he probably didn't believe in. His mother gave him all their food and is dying because of it. Mitchell and Chen are down there right now, proving that we're different from the bastards we're fighting against. That's not a delay, Lieutenant. It's the whole goddamn point of why we're here. Hartley opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Despite his youth and inexperience, he was not a fool. He'd read the reports coming from the concentration camps that other units had liberated Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Agen, Bergen-Belsen. He had seen the photographs that hardened war correspondents could not look at without vomiting. The question that haunted every Allied soldier was simple. How does a civilized nation descend into such barbarism? The answer, Harris knew, was that it happened one small choice at a time, one decision to look away. One moment when convenience trumped compassion. One time when orders mattered more than humanity. 10 minutes, Sergeant, Hartley finally said. Then we move, with or without them. Thank you, sir. As the lieutenant walked away, Private First Class Donald Murphy approached Harris. Murphy was a talker, a joker, the kind of soldier who kept morale high with inappropriate humor and an inexhaustible supply of dirty jokes. But his face was serious now. Sarge, the men are talking. Word got around about what Mitchell and Chen are doing down there. Some of the guys, they're wondering if we should take up a collection. Pull some of our rations, maybe some cigarettes. The kid and his mom could trade those for food from other Germans. Harris felt something catch in his chest. These men, farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Pittsburgh, shop clerks from Los Angeles, had been through hell. They had stormed Normandy's beaches, frozen in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine under fire. They were exhausted, traumatized, desperate to go home. Yet they were willing to sacrifice their own meager comforts for a German boy and his dying mother. Pass the word, Harris said quietly. Anyone who wants to contribute can leave items in my pack. Voluntary only. No pressure on anyone. Within 5 minutes, Harris's pack contained 8 additional care ration boxes, a dozen chocolate bars, 6 packs of cigarettes, 3 pairs of wool socks, and a small Bible with a note written inside the cover for the boy. Tell him God sees him. Private Marcus Washington. Mitchell and Chen emerged from the cellar just as the collection was completing. Wilhelm climbed out behind them, squinting in the daylight, his thin frame more visible now in the harsh afternoon sun. The soldiers who had contributed items gathered around, not crowding, but wanting to see the child they had just helped save. How is she? Harris asked Mitchell. She'll live if she gets consistent food and medical attention. Chen treated her infected wound and we left her for days of rations. But Sarge, the kid's been taking care of her all alone. No other family, no neighbors helping. He's been scavenging through bombed buildings, risking his life, just to find scraps. Harris hefted his now heavy pack and handed it to Wilhelm. The boy's eyes widened as he felt the weight, then widened further as Harris opened it to show him the contents. Wilhelm looked up at the circle of American soldiers, his mouth working but no sound emerging. For you and your mother, Harris said in his Tennessee drawl. Chen translated into German, though the meaning was already clear. Wilhelm's composure finally shattered. The brave facade, the adult responsibility, the desperate strength that had sustained him through weeks of horror, all of it crumbled. He was, once again, simply a 9-year-old boy. He pressed his face against Harris's uniform and sobbed, his small body shaking with great heaving gasps. Harris stood motionless for a moment, then awkwardly patted Wilhelm's head. The sergeant had 3 children of his own waiting in Tennessee: William Jr., age 8, Sarah May, age 6, and little Thomas, who was only 2 when Harris had shipped out and who would not remember his father's face. This German boy could have been any of them, born into different circumstances, speaking a different language, but fundamentally the same: innocent, vulnerable, dependent on adults to create a world worth inheriting. The other soldiers watched in silence. Private Murphy, who usually had a wisecrack for every situation, found himself blinking rapidly and studying the ruins across the street with sudden intensity. Private Marcus Washington, the young black soldier from Alabama who had contributed his Bible, wiped his eyes openly, unashamed. They had all seen death, they had caused death, but this small act of preservation felt more significant than any tactical victory. Lieutenant Hartley approached, his earlier anger replaced with something harder to define. "Sergeant, we need to move," he said, his voice softer now. "But first, let's make sure the boy can get his mother to proper care. Chen, is there a functioning hospital or aid station in this town?" Chen shook his head. "Not that I've seen, sir. The Red Cross unit was supposed to be setting up in the church, but the church tower took a direct hit yesterday. They might have relocated to the school building on the eastern edge of town." "Right." Hartley pulled out his map and made a quick notation. "Sergeant, have Mitchell take the boy and his mother to the school. If there's no medical facility there, he is to radio for a medical transport. We can spare 1 man for an hour." He looked directly at Wilhelm, though the boy could not understand his English. "We don't leave people to die if we can help it. That's not who we are." Wilhelm had stopped crying, but still clutched Harris's uniform. Sergeant gently extracted himself and knelt down to the boy's eye level. He pulled out his wallet and removed a creased photograph of his own children, taken at a county fair in the summer of 1942. William Jr. wore knickers and a cap. Sarah May had ribbons in her hair. Baby Thomas was cradled in their mother's arms. "My children," Harris said simply, pointing to each face. "William, Sarah, Thomas." He pointed to Wilhelm, then to the photograph, then to his own chest over his heart. "Same." Wilhelm understood. Despite different languages, different uniforms, different flags, the message was universal. You are someone's child, and that makes you precious. That makes you worth saving. Mitchell helped Wilhelm secure the heavy pack, showing him how to distribute the weight properly. "You take care of your mother," he said, speaking slowly. "You are very brave. Your father would be proud." At the mention of his father, Wilhelm's face became complicated: grief and pride and confusion, all mixing together. His father had died fighting for Hitler for a cause that had brought nothing but destruction to Germany and the world. Yet he had also been a man who taught Wilhelm to read, who carved him a wooden horse for his 6th birthday, who had kissed him goodbye at the train station in Torgau when he left for the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942. "My papa was good man," Wilhelm said carefully in English. "He did not like Nazis. He had to fight where they would hurt us. He told me before he left, be kind, be brave, protect Mutter. I tried to do what he said." Mitchell felt his throat tighten. This was the truth that propaganda on both sides tried to hide. The enemy was not a faceless mass of evil, but individuals, most of whom were simply trying to survive, trying to protect their families, trying to find meaning in a world that had descended into madness. "You did exactly what he asked," Mitchell said firmly. "Now we're going to make sure you both survive this. Come on, let's get your mother moved." They descended back into the cellar, where Helga had managed to sit up slightly, the food and water already beginning to restore some measure of strength. When she saw the heavy pack Wilhelm carried and understood what it contained, her gaunt face transformed with an emotion so powerful that it transcended language. Overwhelming gratitude mixed with crushing shame that her family required charity for men whose countrymen they had been trying to kill just days before. "Bit," she whispered. "Thank them. Tell them, ... double quotes. She spoke rapidly to Wilhelm in German, and the boy translated, "She says she does not have words big enough. She says she will teach me to remember this day always, to remember that Americans saved us when they did not have to. She says she will tell everyone what you did after the war, so people know that kindness existed even in the worst times." Chen helped Helga to her feet, supporting her weight as her legs trembled from weeks of malnutrition. Mitchell fashioned a crude walking stick from a piece of debris, testing its strength before handing it to her. Together, the small group made their way up the cellar steps and into the late afternoon light. The town of Torgo stretched before them, a landscape of destruction that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. The medieval marketplace, where generations of Germans had bought bread and gossip, was now a field of rubble. The houses where children had been born and old people had died peacefully in their beds were hollow shells. The future itself seemed to have been bombed into oblivion. Yet as Wilhelm helped his mother navigate the debris-strewn street, supported by an American corporal who had every reason to hate Germans, something improbable was being born amid the ruins. It was fragile and easily destroyed, but it was real. The possibility of reconciliation. The hope that humanity could rebuild not just buildings but trust. The walk to the school building should have taken 10 minutes in peacetime. In the devastated Torgo of April 1945, it became an odyssey through a landscape that resembled biblical descriptions of the apocalypse. Mitchell supported Helga on one side, Wilhelm on the other, as they picked their way through streets that had been transformed into obstacle courses of twisted metal, collapsed masonry, and the detritus of shattered lives. Every few yards, they encountered remnants of the ordinary world that had existed before the war consumed it. A child's doll lay in the gutter, its porcelain face cracked, but its blue eyes still staring upward with eerie optimism. A framed wedding portrait protruded from a pile of bricks, the young couple frozen in black and white happiness, their future already past. A metronome sat inexplicably intact on a pile of rubble, its pendulum still visible, though eternally silenced. Wilhelm pointed out landmarks as they walked, his young voice providing a ghost tour of his destroyed hometown. That was Herr Fischer's bakery. He made the best apple strudel in Saxony. My papa said so. The Gestapo took Herr Fischer away in 1943 because someone heard him say the war was lost. We never saw him again. The boy's tone was matter of fact, as if the disappearance of neighbors had become routine. That building with the broken clock tower was our school. Fräulein Weber taught us mathematics and German literature. She was very strict but fair. She cried when she read us the death notice about her son. He was killed in France. After that, she was never the same. Helga squeezed her son's hand, a gesture that needed no translation. Mitchell found himself imagining what Torgo had been like before the madness, a prosperous Saxon town with centuries of history. Citizens going about their lives, complaining about taxes and weather, falling in love, raising children, growing old. All of it swept away by a lunatic's vision of racial supremacy and territorial conquest. They passed a group of German civilians emerging from cellars and basements. Now that the fighting had moved east, these were the survivors, mostly women, children, and old men. The young men were dead in Russia, France, Africa, or Italy, their bodies scattered across a continent they had tried to conquer. The survivors watched the small procession with expressions that ranged from fear to curiosity to desperate hope. An elderly woman approached, her courage apparently overcoming her caution. She spoke to Helga in rapid German, gesturing toward the American soldier in Wilhelm's heavy pack. Helga responded, and the old woman's weathered face crumpled. She reached out and touched Mitchell's sleeve, speaking words he could not understand but whose meaning was clear. She says, "God bless you," Wilhelm translated. She says her grandson is Wilhelm's age, is not eaten in 6 days. She asks if the Americans will help everyone, or just us. Mitchell felt the weight of that question like a physical burden. How could he explain that official policy discouraged fraternization, that resources were limited, that military objectives took precedence over civilian welfare? How could he justify saving one child and one woman while thousands more suffered? "Tell her the Red Cross is coming," he said finally. "Tell her international relief organizations will be here soon to help everyone. Tell her to hold on just a little longer." As Wilhelm translated, Mitchell wondered if he was lying. The bureaucracy of humanitarian aid moved slowly, tangled in politics and competing priorities. How many would die in the gap between military conquest and civilian relief? How many Wilhelm Beckers and Helga Beckers would not find an American soldier willing to bend the rules? They continued walking, passing more survivors emerging from their hiding places. Mitchell noticed something that initially puzzled him. Many of the women had deliberately dirtied their faces and wore multiple layers of shapeless clothing despite the mild spring weather. Then understanding hit him with sickening clarity. These women were trying to make themselves unattractive, hiding their femininity as protection against the occupying soldiers. The stories had already spread through the American ranks. Reports from the Eastern Front of Soviet soldiers taking brutal revenge on German civilians for the atrocities committed in Russia. The Red Army, which had suffered 20 million dead and witnessed the deliberate starvation of Leningrad, the massacre at Babi Yar, and countless other horrors, was not inclined toward mercy. The women of Eastern Germany were learning that defeat had its own special terrors. American forces had strict orders against such behavior, backed by swift military justice. General Dwight David Eisenhower had made clear that Allied soldiers would conduct themselves with discipline and honor. But Mitchell understood why these women took precautions. War had taught them that uniforms, regardless of nationality, could conceal monsters. The school building finally came into view, its structure remarkably intact compared to the surrounding devastation. Mitchell felt a surge of relief when he spotted the distinctive flags, the Red Cross banner flying alongside the American flag. The aid station was operational. The school's main hall had been converted into a makeshift hospital that would have made any peacetime medical professional weep. Wounded civilians occupied every available space, lying on desks, benches, and bare floors. The smell of antiseptic barely masked the underlying odors of infected wounds, unwashed bodies, and fear. Army nurses moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency, their faces masks of professional concentration that occasionally cracked to reveal the emotional toll of treating an endless stream of human suffering. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, a 42-year-old nurse from Boston who had served in North Africa and Italy before arriving in Germany, looked up from the child she was examining as Mitchell helped Helga through the door. Morrison's uniform was stained with blood, some fresh, some dried to rusty brown, and exhaustion had carved deep lines around her eyes, yet her voice remained steady and kind. "What have we here, Corporal?" "Ma'am, civilian casualty, severe malnutrition, untreated wound infection, general weakness." Her son found us and asked for help. We provided emergency rations and first aid, but she needs proper medical attention. Morrison gestured to an empty desk near the window. "Bring her over here." "What's her name?" "Helga Becker, ma'am." "The boy is Wilhelm." The captain examined Helga with swift competence, her experienced hands checking pulse, examining the bandaged wound Chen had treated, assessing the extent of starvation damage. She spoke to a German nurse's aide who was assisting the American medical staff. A middle-aged woman whose red armband indicated she was a neutral medical volunteer. "Frau Becker, you are severely malnourished but not beyond recovery," Morrison said through the translator. "The infection in your arm is serious but responding to the sulfa treatment. You need rest, continued nutrition, and monitoring for organ damage. We'll keep you here under observation for at least 3 days." Helga tried to protest. Mitchell could see the maternal panic in her eyes, even without understanding the German words. She was afraid to be separated from Wilhelm, afraid that in this chaos she would lose track of her son. Wilhelm seemed to understand his mother's fear without being told. He gripped her hand and spoke to her urgently in German, his young face set with determination. The translator smiled despite the grim surroundings. He's telling her that he will stay right here, that he will not leave her side, that the Americans have given them food, so he will be fine. He's quite insistent. Captain Morrison looked at Wilhelm appraisingly. "How old are you, son?" 9 years, ma'am," Wilhelm responded in careful English. "Almost 10. My birthday is July 3rd. 9 years old," Morrison repeated softly, shaking her head. She looked at Mitchell. "This boy has been keeping his mother alive on his own, no other family." "None that we know of, ma'am. Father killed at Stalingrad, house destroyed. They've been living in a cellar." Morrison made a decision. "He can stay. We'll find him a cot near his mother. We have extra rations now that the supply trucks have caught up with the advance. He can help around the station, fetch water, run messages. God knows we can use an extra pair of hands, and it will give him something productive to do." Wilhelm's face lit up with relief so profound that Mitchell felt his own eyes burning. The boy bowed to Captain Morrison, formal, old-fashioned gesture that belonged to a more courteous Ajand, spoke in German. "He says thank you, and he swears he will work very hard and not be any trouble," the translator provided. Morrison ruffled Wilhelm's hair with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with her military bearing. "Tell him he's already been through more than most soldiers I know. He's earned his keep just by surviving." Mitchell realized his part in this story was ending. He had delivered Wilhelm and Helga to safety. Now he needed to rejoin his unit. But something made him hesitate. He fished in his pocket and found a crumpled piece of paper and a stubby pencil. He wrote carefully, then handed the paper to Wilhelm. "This is my name and my home address in Michigan. After the war, when things are normal again, you write to me. You tell me how you and your mother are doing. You understand?" Wilhelm stared at the paper as if it were a sacred document. "You want me to write? To America?" "Yes. I want to know you're okay. I want to know your mother got better. Promise me you'll write." Wilhelm nodded solemnly. "I promise, Corporal Mitchell, I will write. I will tell you everything." They shook hands, man to boy, American to German, victor to vanquished, but more importantly, human to human. Mitchell turned to leave, but Wilhelm called after him. "Corporal Mitchell." "Wait." The boy dug into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was the battered tin soldier that Mitchell had seen in the cellar, a Prussian infantryman from an earlier era of German military history. "For you, so you remember me?" Mitchell accepted the tiny soldier, its paint worn away by years of a child's play. "I could never forget you, Wilhelm. Never." As Mitchell walked back through the shattered streets of Torgau to rejoin his unit, the tin soldier nestled in his pocket like a talisman. Above him, the April sky was beginning to clear, the smoke from burning buildings finally dissipating. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of artillery as the war continued its inexorable march toward Berlin and final victory. But for one brief afternoon, in one small German town, the war had paused long enough for mercy to manifest. And that, Mitchell thought, was worth more than any tactical objective. Sergeant Harris waited at the designated assembly point. His squad gathered around him in varying states of restlessness. Lieutenant Hartley stood apart, consulting his map and radio equipment, coordinating with battalion headquarters about their next objective. When Mitchell finally appeared, jogging through the rubble-strewn streets, Harris felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "She's at the aid station," Mitchell reported, slightly out of breath. "Captain Morrison says she'll recover with proper care. The boy's staying with her, helping out around the medical facility." "Good work, Corporal." Harris paused, then added more quietly, "Your mother would be proud of what you did today." Mitchell nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He rejoined the squad, taking his position in the formation. Private Chen handed him his rifle, which he had been safeguarding, and the two men exchanged a look that communicated volumes without words. Lieutenant Hartley called out, "Squad, prepare to move out. Our objective is the village of Pristowitz, 5 miles east. Intelligence reports minimal enemy resistance, but stay alert. The war isn't over yet." As they began marching, Private Murphy sidled up next to Mitchell. "So, Mitchell, you gonna tell us what it was like down in that cellar? The kid's mom really as bad off as he said?" Mitchell described what he had seen, and as he spoke, other soldiers drew closer, listening intently. The story spread through the squad, then to other squads as they marched. By evening, when they bivouacked in a commandeered barn outside Pristowitz, soldiers from other platoons were asking about the German kid and his mother. Something about Wilhelm's story resonated with these combat-hardened men. Perhaps it was because it reminded them that behind the enemy they had been fighting were ordinary people families torn apart by ideology. They might not have believed in children who suffered for the sins of their leaders, mothers who made the ultimate sacrifice for their sons. Private Washington pulled out his battered journal that night and wrote by candlelight. April 12th, 1945. "Today we met a German boy named Wilhelm. He was braver than most soldiers I know. His mother was dying, and he had the courage to ask his country's enemies for help. We gave him food and medicine. I don't know if this will change anything in the big picture, but it changed something in me. War makes you forget that the enemy bleeds and loves and suffers just like we do," Wilhelm reminded me. God bless that kid. The story of Wilhelm Becker reached beyond just Mitchell's squad. In the coming days, as American forces continued their advance and more towns fell under Allied control, soldiers remembered the boy in Torgau. When they encountered other starving German civilians, some of them found it harder to simply walk past. A few extra rations here, a shared canteen of water, their small acts of mercy that cost little but meant everything. Captain Morrison, too, found herself affected by Wilhelm's presence at the aid station. The boy proved to be an invaluable helper, translating between German civilians and American medical staff, fetching supplies with cheerful efficiency, and bringing an unexpected note of hope to the makeshift hospital. His dedication to his recovering mother and his gratitude toward the Americans who had saved her became a living example of the possibility of reconciliation. One evening, as Morrison was changing Helga's bandages, she spoke through the translator about her own story. She had been a teacher before the war, educated at Leipzig University with a degree in German literature. Her husband, Klaus Becker, had been a railway engineer, a quiet man who loved Goethe and Schiller, played violin badly but with great enthusiasm, who had never joined the Nazi Party despite pressure from his employers. He saw where it was leading, Helga said, her voice still weak but growing stronger each day. In 1938, after Kristallnacht, he came home and wept. He said Germany had lost its soul. But what could we do? We had a young son. People who spoke out disappeared. People who resisted were hanged. We kept our heads down and hoped it would pass, that sanity would return. It never did. According to historian Anthony Beever's research documented in the fall of Berlin 1945, millions of Germans found themselves trapped in exactly this position, opposed to the Nazi regime, but powerless to act against it without risking their families. The moral complexity of collective guilt would haunt Germany for generations. Morrison listened to Helga's story with complicated emotions. Her own brother had died at Anzio, killed by German artillery in January 1944. Part of her wanted to rage at this woman, to hold her accountable for the sins of her nation. But looking at Helga's wasted frame, at Wilhelm sleeping on a cot nearby with his mother's shawl clutched in his small fist, Morrison could not sustain her anger. The war will be over soon, Morrison told Helga through the translator. Then comes the hard part, rebuilding. Not just the buildings, but trust, civilization itself. Your son will inherit whatever world we create from these ashes. We owe it to him, to all the children, to do better than our generation did. Helga reached out and took Morrison's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Thank you for seeing us as people, not just enemies. Thank you for saving my son's mother, so he does not have to grow up an orphan. I will spend the rest of my life teaching Wilhelm about the Americans who showed mercy when they did not have to. This story will be his inheritance. 3 days after Mitchell brought Wilhelm and Helga to the aid station, an event occurred in Torgau that would become one of the war's most iconic moments. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, effectively cutting Germany in two. The meeting took place on the very bridge that Sergeant Harris had been studying the day Wilhelm first appeared. Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue of the 69th Infantry Division led the first American patrol to make contact with Soviet forces. Photographs captured the moment. American and Soviet soldiers embracing, were shaking hands, sharing cigarettes and vodka, celebrating their shared victory over fascism. The images would be published in newspapers around the world, symbols of Allied unity and the imminent end of the European war. One Soviet soldier, a lieutenant whose uniform bore the distinctive red star and medals earned in campaigns from Stalingrad to Berlin, noticed Wilhelm watching from the crowd. The lieutenant approached, his expression unreadable. Wilhelm's heart pounded with terror. Stories of Soviet revenge against German civilians had spread throughout the town. But the Soviet officer simply crouched down to Wilhelm's eye level and spoke in heavily accented German. "How old are you, boy?" "9 years, sir." "Almost 10?" The lieutenant studied Wilhelm's thin frame, the signs of recent starvation still evident despite 3 days of regular meals. "My son was your age," he said quietly. The Germans killed him in 1941 during the siege of Leningrad. He starved to death while the Wehrmacht blockaded our city. Wilhelm did not know what to say. The weight of collective guilt pressed down on his young shoulders. Guilt for crimes he did not commit, but that had been done in his nation's name. The Soviet officer seemed to read his thoughts. "You are not responsible for what your leaders did," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you will live with the consequences. Russia has lost 20 million people. 20 million. How do we forgive that? How do we rebuild from that?" He stood up, looking across the Elbe to where American and Soviet flags flew side by side. "Maybe we start by not killing the children. Maybe that's where forgiveness begins." He reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of hard black bread, the same ration that had sustained Soviet soldiers through their long march from Moscow to Berlin. He handed it to Wilhelm. "Eat, boy. Survive. Tell your children what happened here. So maybe it never happens again." Wilhelm accepted the bread with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. This Soviet soldier, who had every reason to hate Germans, who had lost his own son to German aggression, was showing mercy. Just as the Americans had shown mercy 3 days earlier. That evening, Wilhelm returned to the aid station and told his mother about the encounter. Helga, now strong enough to sit up and take short walks, listened intently. When Wilhelm finished, she pulled him close and spoke with an intensity that made her words feel like a sacred vow. "Listen to me, my son. What you have witnessed these past few days is something rare and precious. Proof that even in the darkest times, human beings can choose kindness over cruelty. The Americans saved us when they could have walked past. That Soviet officer gave you bread when he could have taken revenge. These moments are lights in the darkness. You must remember them. You must tell your children and grandchildren. You must be a witness to the fact that mercy survived when the whole world seemed intent on destroying it." Wilhelm nodded solemnly, understanding that he carried a responsibility greater than his 9 years. He was a living testament to the possibility of redemption, to the idea that enemies could become, if not friends, at least fellow humans worthy of compassion. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The death camps were liberated, revealing horrors that would scar the collective consciousness of humanity. The Nuremberg trials began, attempting to impose justice on the architects of genocide. Germany was divided among the Allied powers, and the long process of denazification commenced. Corporal James Mitchell returned to Michigan in October 1945, one of millions of soldiers demobilized after victory. He carried with him the physical and psychological scars of combat, shrapnel fragments in his left leg, nightmares about friends who had died, and an inability to tolerate sudden loud noises. But he also carried something else, the memory of a 9-year-old German boy who had taught him that the enemy was human. Mitchell resumed his pre-war life as a machinist at an automotive factory in Detroit. He married his sweetheart, Dorothy, who had waited 3 years for his return. They bought a small house on the outskirts of the city and began building the peacetime life that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of the war. In June 1946, more than a year after their encounter in Torgau, a letter arrived. The envelope was battered from its journey across a still chaotic Europe, addressed in careful childish handwriting, Corporal James Mitchell, Michigan, United States of America. Mitchell's hand shook as he opened it. The letter was written in English, with occasional German words when Wilhelm's vocabulary failed him. "Dear Corporal Mitchell, I hope this letter finds you well and safe in your home. I promised I would write to you, and I keep my promises. My mother is completely recovered. She gained back her weight and her strength. She works now as a teacher again, helping to educate children in the new Germany. It is not much, but it is ours, and it is warm, and we have enough food. I think about that day often. I think about how you and Private Chen came down into our dark cellar and brought light. I think about Sergeant Harris and all the soldiers who gave us their food. I think about Captain Morrison, who saved my mother's life at the aid station. My mother says I must study hard and make something good of my life, to honor the kindness you showed us. She says the best way to repay mercy is to pass it on to others. So I try to be kind to everyone I meet, even when it is difficult. Germany is very different now. Many people are ashamed of what our country did. I learned about the camps, about the terrible things that were done to Jewish people and others. When I learned this, I cried for days. How could my country do such evil? My mother says that good people stayed silent when they should have spoken, and that silence allowed evil to grow. But she also says that people like you prove that goodness exists too. She says that in the worst moment of our lives, Americans showed us mercy. She says I must remember that people can choose to be kind, even to their enemies. Thank you, Corporal Mitchell. Thank you for seeing me and my mother as people worth saving. I will never forget you." Your friend, Wilhelm Becker Mitchell, read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Dorothy. She watched tears roll down her husband's face, the first time she had seen him cry since his return. "Who's Wilhelm?" she asked gently. Mitchell told her the story of that April day in Torgau, describing the desperate boy and his dying mother. The decision to help despite orders discouraging fraternization, the collection taken up by soldiers who had every reason to hate Germans, but chose compassion instead. "I've been having nightmares about the war," Mitchell admitted. "About the men I killed, about friends who died in my arms, about the concentration camps we liberated. Some nights I wake up and wonder if any of it meant anything, if all that death and destruction achieved anything good. But this letter tells me that at least one thing we did mattered. We saved a boy and his mother. We showed mercy when we didn't have to. It counts for something." Dorothy held her husband as he wept, understanding that Wilhelm's letter had given Mitchell something he desperately needed. Proof that amid the carnage and horror, humanity had survived. Mitchell wrote back immediately, beginning a correspondence that would last for decades. Sent packages to Wilhelm's school supplies, books in German that he found at specialty bookstores in Detroit, chocolates and warm clothing. Each package was a refutation of the hatred that had caused the war, a small bridge built across the chasm that had divided nations. Wilhelm's letters charted his growth from boy to man. He wrote about finishing school, about studying engineering at university, about meeting a young woman named Greta whom he would eventually marry. He wrote about the birth of his first child, a son he named James, in honor of the American soldier who had saved his mother. In 1965, 20 years after their meeting in Torgau, Wilhelm made his first trip to America. He was now 30 years old, a successful engineer working on reconstruction projects in the Federal Republic of Germany. He brought his wife and young son James to Michigan, where Mitchell, now 45. Graying and slightly stout, welcomed them with tears and embraces. They spent a week together, two families united by an act of mercy, performed in the ruins of war. Wilhelm's son James played with Mitchell's children. The adults talked late into the night, sharing stories, building understanding, proving that former enemies could become friends. "You changed my life that day," Wilhelm told Mitchell as they sat on the porch of the Michigan house, watching the children play in the yard. "You made me believe that people could be good, even in the worst circumstances. That belief saved me from bitterness and hatred. It allowed me to build a life instead of dwelling in the past." Mitchell shook his head. "I just gave you some food and got your mother to a doctor. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Wilhelm said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people walked past us. Most people were too tired, too focused on their orders, too hardened by war to care about one German boy and his dying mother. You chose to care. That choice echoed through my entire life." Mitchell pulled the old tin soldier from his pocket. He carried it everywhere, a reminder of that April day. "You gave me this to remember you, but I never needed a reminder. Some things you don't forget." They sat in comfortable silence. Two men who had met as enemy nationals in the worst circumstances imaginable, and who had, through choice and effort, transformed that enmity into lasting friendship. Wilhelm's son James ran up to the porch, breathless and happy. "Papa, Mr. Mitchell, come play with us." Wilhelm looked at Mitchell and smiled. "Come on, James. Let's go play with the children. After all, they are the future. They will inherit whatever world we leave them. We owe it to them to leave something better than what we inherited." As they walked toward the playing children, American and German, growing up in peace, innocent of the hatreds that had consumed their parents' generation, Mitchell felt a sense of rightness. The war had been necessary to stop genuine evil. But what gave that war meaning? What justified all the death and suffering were moments like these, when former enemies chose reconciliation over revenge, when mercy triumphed over hatred, when the future was allowed to be different from the past. In the end, that was what Wilhelm's desperate plea in the ruins of Torgau had been about. Not just saving one mother and son, but saving the possibility of a better world. And in that better world, a German boy named Wilhelm and an American soldier named James could become friends, proving that humanity's capacity for compassion could survive even the most brutal attempts to destroy it. The story of Mama Hasn't Eaten for Days became more than just an anecdote from World War II. It became a testament to the truth that in the darkest times, individual human beings still have the power to choose kindness. And sometimes those choices echo through generations, rippling outward to create a world where former enemies can sit together on a porch in Michigan, watching their children play in peace. This, ultimately, was the unthinkable thing that American soldiers did that April day in 1945. They remembered their own humanity. And in doing so, they preserved the humanity of those who had been their enemies. It was a small act in the context of a massive war, but for Wilhelm Becker and Helga Becker, it was everything. And for James Mitchell and the soldiers who contributed to that day's mercy, it was the moment that gave meaning to all the sacrifice and suffering that had come before. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple kindness. Sometimes the most heroic choice is to see the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. And sometimes the actions that change the world are not the great battles or strategic victories, at the quiet moments when one person decides that compassion matters more than convenience, that mercy is stronger than revenge, and that even in war, love can survive. Wilhelm Becker never forgot that lesson, neither did James Mitchell. And through their friendship, through Wilhelm's teaching of his children and grandchildren, through Mitchell's telling and retelling of the story to anyone who would listen, the memory of that day in Torgau lived on, a reminder that no matter how dark the times, human beings retain the capacity to choose light.